There we go.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Chris, because you can see she's in a mask, called me not very long ago, as in just a little bit ago, and said, would I please introduce my friend Betsey, and I'm happy to do that. But then first Coral says we have to remember the bucket. And you all know that we put the donation bucket in the back room of the room because, well, this is the bucket that Carlo made, so this is the bucket we've got. And these donations, the community center has always been very, very gracious to the Devil's Gate History Club, and these donations go to helping us give something back to the community center. Am I correct? Okay, so when I finish my introduction, I will put the bucket back over by the piano, and please don't forget it on your way out. So this evening, we are very, very pleased to have Betsey Blakeslee, who will talk to us about something I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try to. I can say reclaiming, but that's as far as I can get in that sentence. And she will be telling you all about that. But to introduce Betsey herself, you know, Betsey and Don bought a house in this town 40 years ago in 1982, and they had it for about 15 years, and I first got to know Betsey a little bit during that period of time. And they always said, you know, we're going to retire here. You know, lots of people say they're going to retire, correct? But they always said, you know, we're actually going to retire here. We will be back to retire here. But in the intervening years, because husband Don is also Dr. Don and also Colonel Don, and that means you're in the Army and you're moving from place to place to place, there have been lots of adventures in between those first years in Georgetown and the fact that 10 years ago they actually bought a house in Georgetown to which they have actually retired. In some of those intervening trips, at some station along the line, Betsey decided that she would acquire a PhD in American Studies, which she did from the University of Maryland, which I think gave her the kind of background that when they did end up at West Point, and when she, to entertain herself, was out wandering the grounds of West Point, she became interested in any number of things that she found there and how you would restore them and how you would reclaim that part of our American history. And that's what she's here to tell us about tonight. And we're really glad that Betsey and Don are back with us.
So there are two things that tie the United States Military Academy at West Point to Georgetown. You may know or you may not know that there are only 2,600 National Historic Landmark Districts in America. One of them is West Point, and one of them is Georgetown Silver Cliff. So it's quite an honor for, can you hear me all right?
Oh, yes.
Great, okay. It's quite an honor for any location in the United States of America to be a National Historic Landmark District. And we're just really thrilled to be back here. Now, there's a reason why talking about this particular garden is very important at this stage of our history. Because what's about to happen in 2026, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And so there's going to be huge celebrations all over. And I'm going to tell you the story of why I think this is significant. It's really going to touch on the American Revolution. And I'm going to take you through what my learning process was. So, as you know, Cindy mentioned that I have a PhD in American Studies, which is the study of American culture from an interdisciplinary standpoint. But I will tell you that when we got stationed at West Point, is it 12 years ago, John? 12 years ago. I was walking on the plane. How many people here have visited West Point? Anybody? Oh, okay, good. A couple of people have. That's great. Well, it's quite spectacularly beautiful. And, but I stood outside on the plane and looked over across the river and was with the son of one of Don's classmates. Don graduated in 1970. And we met in 1966, freshman year. So, at any rate, the person who was standing next to me was the son of Don's classmate, and he's the head of the history department at West Point. And he said to me, so you realize, don't you, that Benedict Arnold was trying to take down Fortress West Point. He's selling it to the British for the equivalent of $250,000. And I thought to myself, wow, I've heard so much about Benedict Arnold my whole life, but I did not connect that to the fact that Fortress West Point was what Benedict Arnold was selling. And I think by the time we're through with this, you'll understand why that was so significant. So try to put your mind into a place that says, wow, in 3 years we're going to be doing a lot of talking about the American Revolution. And so I think this will give you, I'm sure some of you are very familiar, but it'll give you a grounding in that. So we, Don had actually been an Army doctor for 20 years and retired. And then when they did the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, they asked former Army doctors to come back into the Army. And so Don said, I would like to do this. I'd like to go back in the Army. And I said, well, they're never going to take you back in the Army, Don, because I don't know how old you were, but pretty old.
I was over 60.
Yeah, over 60, right. And, but this is Don's way, he's making phone calls, blah, 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 and he said, well, if they did take me back, would you be willing to do this? And I said, of course, that would be fascinating to do that. And the bottom line was that they did accept him back in the Army, and he was stationed at West Point, which is where we met in 1966. So it came full circle. And I will tell you, you're looking at Kosciuszko here, and you're going to learn a lot about him, and it's going to have a lot to do with the American Revolution. But the first night that I met Don at that dance, he took me on a tour of West Point. And the first place we went was to the Kosciuszko Memorial. And I said, who is that guy? I have no idea who that is. So when we got stationed back at West Point, I was out for a walk, and I came upon this garden. And it was kind of in really tough shape, but it was really a lovely setting. And so I called Don at work and said, he was at the hospital, and said, there's an amazing garden here. Have you ever been in it? And you had never been in it either, had you? Oh, you had been, yeah. So at any rate, I got very interested in saving the garden. Now I'm going to give you the back story on some of this. So I went to the garrison commander and I said, wow, this garden is amazing, but it needs to be put back together. And he said, oh, well, you should do that. I said, great. Then I talked to the president of the Friends of Kosciuszko Association at West Point. And he said, well, you can't work on that garden unless you speak with General Rowney. General Rowney was he a 4-star or 4-star. General Rowney was in Washington, D.C., and his family had donated money for the upkeep of the garden. And I won't go into all the details about who's supposed to be doing that upkeep, but it wasn't being upkept. So I said, well, I'm going to go down to Washington and meet with General Rowney. Now, who's General Rowney? General Rowney is a 4-star general who was the chief salt talk negotiator for 4 presidents. He was also the strategic planner for MacArthur. And so this is like a really important guy, right? And I called him and I said, General Rowney, you don't know me, but I'm here at West Point and I'm concerned about the condition of the garden and I think we could really do some things to fix it up. And I'd like to come down and talk to you. He said, all right, come on down. So I went down, knocked on the door of his house, and the guy is huge. He's like 6'4" or something. But, you know, he was probably, what do you think, he was 85 at that point? And so he talked to me, and I talked to him, and he was pretty suspicious about who I was and what my plan was. But by the end of our conversation, it was a really warm relationship. And later on, when he came to West Point to be honored as the oldest living graduate of West Point, he gave a speech to a bunch of people about Kosciuszko's garden. And in the middle of the speech, he said, and this is the best compliment I've ever had in my whole life. Are you ready? He said, you've got officers and cadets and everybody there. He said, I sure wish I'd had Betsey at the Battle of the Bulge. So I was pretty relentless about this. And we'll go through some of this, but I want you to know that what this eventually led to was the establishment of the Friends of the American Revolution at West Point. And so that organization is raising $18 million to save the 27 existing fortifications that were built under the command of General Washington during the American Revolution. So that kind of gives you a little bit of context for that. Can you tell the altitude?
Betsy,
Yeah.
could you pull that a little bit further away from me?
Leave the too high. Pardon me.
Oh, excuse me.
I think that if we do this, go ahead and speak.
Okay, but can you still hear me?
Yeah, but
Okay.
we won't get the.
All right, great.
You can read it as hard as you like now.
Okay, so Kosciuszko himself, I mean, I had to learn everything about him. And this garden is not a garden that was built in dedication to Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko was the chief engineer that designed and built the 17 fortifications at West Point that prevented the British from being able to capture the Hudson River, which was the primary communication channel, because the roads were terrible, of course, then, between the northern colonies and the southern colonies. And so I'll continue to talk about this. Let's see. Here we go. All right. So this is important because it's about gardens. And we have to think about this, I think, in terms of Georgetown as well. History has no memory of the great majority of gardens that have graced the earth over the millennia. Gardens being by nature impermanent creations that only rarely leave behind evidence of their existence. So Kosciuszko's garden was not dedicated to him. It was built by him during the American Revolution. Okay, where am I here? First built 245 years ago by Kosciuszko. And you're going to learn a lot more about him in a minute and why he's so important. It's not a garden built in honor of him. It was actually built while he was designing and head of construction of the 27 fortifications that were to prevent the British from being able to take the Hudson River. West Point is a National Historic Landmark District. Landmark. And contains the same registration that Georgetown does, which is reserved for historic properties possessing national significance and illustrating or representing the history of the United States. To qualify for this status, the property must also contain historic integrity, as Georgetown does. Section 110 of this organization requires federal agencies to undertake planning and actions as necessary to minimize harm to any designated aspect of a National Historic Landmark District. So some of you may know that we're having some discussions with Excel right now. And part of those discussions are, don't diminish the historic aspects of the buildings that are contributing to the historic district. Okay, so I should have had like a clicker, right? Okay. So the areas at West Point that make it a National Historic Landmark status are the plain. The plain is a great big open field that sits. The thing that's amazing about West Point is that it's one of only 2 fjords in the United States of America. The other one is Acadia, right, in Maine. And so the reason that it's a fjord is because when the ice and water came running down from the mountains, they had to turn a very sharp corner at West Point, because West Point is entirely based on top of granite. The whole thing is granite. And right now they're building a new engineering center at West Point, and they've dug out an entire side of the mountain, hillside, and it's just sheer granite. So you can see why there was a big turn that had to take place. And I'll show you a map in a minute. The academic area, that would be the military academy. Now the military academy was established in 1804 by President Jefferson at the site of the fortifications at West Point. So that is the tie between them. And Kosciuszko's garden, it was existing at that time. Flirtation walk is the term that cadets used for many years to describe what was actually the Revolutionary Supply Trail, the place where they would dock, and any delivery of cannon or anything having to do with the building of the fortifications would be done on that walk. The superintendent's garden was designed by Ellen Biddle Shipman. For any people that are like really into gardens, she was the premier female garden designer during the early 19th century. And she designed the superintendent's garden. And then the West Point Cemetery is also part of the national, is also a garden. And there's another garden across the river, which is on the property of West Point. And that's a garden that was created by two sisters whose all brothers had fought in the American Revolution. So that's a very old garden as well, and that's also preserved. I should put you over here, Don. Let me do that. Of the 6 landmarks at West Point that confer the designation of the National Register of Historic Places, only Kosciuszko's garden, when I got there, and Flirtation Walk, which is the Revolutionary Supply Trail, were in disrepair. Have you got the right button?
I'm pretty sure. It's her computer.
Right here.
Got it. You ready?
Yep, I'm ready. Thank you. All right, so this is Kosciuszko's memorial at West Point. So who was this guy? Why does he matter? So you can go to the next. These are recent publications. Now, when I got to West Point, I was driving down to our daughter's house, which was about an hour away, and I heard on NPR this guy, Alex Dorozinski, interviewed about the guy named Kosciuszko. And I'm like, wow, really? Yeah, he's publishing a book on Kosciuszko. Well, it turns out that Alex Dorozinski is the president of the Kosciuszko Foundation, which has members all over the country of Polish heritage. Anybody hear of Polish heritage? Okay. So, but it's a very, very big organization. And so, I found out that really good friends of ours that we had been stationed with in Germany during the Cold War were also living there, and he was an expert on the American Revolution. And he actually helped with editing this book. So the next, thank you. All right, this is also a very important book because this is written by Gary Nash, who's one of the leading American history educators in America. And essentially, this is a book about Jefferson, Kosciuszko, and Agrippa Hull. And Agrippa Hull was the aide-de-camp to Kosciuszko when he was building the fortifications. He grew up in Massachusetts. He was never a slave. He always had freedom. And he became a very critical player in participating in helping Kosciuszko. Now, here's another story that came out of nowhere. So I did a web seminar with Jim Johnson, and this is out of Marist College. And a woman called me after that and said, I'd like to talk to you about my great-grandfather. I said, oh, okay, did he serve in the Revolution? She said, yes, actually, he helped to build the fortifications. He was with the 6th Connecticut Regiment. I said, wow, that's fantastic. Do you have information about that? She said, yes. He was a member of the 6th Connecticut Regiment, which was made up of 60 free African Americans, regular Army soldiers who received a pension from George Washington at the end of the war. And I'm like, are you serious? There were African American soldiers that were here at West Point. So things like this happened over a 10-year period. It would just be unbelievable stories. But Agrippa Hull was very important and really helped Kosciuszko to keep this all organized. Okay, so the next slide. Okay, I'll do this quickly. He was appointed by Benjamin Franklin. We think that Kosciuszko first heard about the fact that Silas Deane was in Paris because he was auditing classes at the Paris Military Institute. And And so Benjamin Franklin caught wind of him, and he decided to hop on a boat and come to America and help out. And he was a very accomplished engineer. He designed the fortifications for Fort Ticonderoga. Has anybody been to Fort Ticonderoga? Okay. And which were not implemented the way that he thought they should be, and that resulted in the defeat at Ticonderoga. So then he was appointed by George Washington to design the fortifications at the Battle of Saratoga. And the Battle of Saratoga is really important because the fact that we won at the Battle of Saratoga, because Kosciuszko insisted on building on the high ground, meant that who decided to write us a big check? Which country?
France.
France. Right. And this really changed really changed the course of the history of the American Revolution. And it was because of his success at Saratoga as the engineer that this happened. I've told you he designed and oversaw construction of the fortifications. Benedict Arnold was all ready to hand it over. There's so much wonderful research being done on Benedict Arnold in the last 5 years, and we have learned a lot about how insidious this whole thing was, and I won't take you all through that, but it's really worth reading about. He was responsible for getting the Great Chain in and out of the river. The Great Chain was made of huge iron connectors that was spread across the river to prevent the British from being able to sail up or down. Up from Canada, because the British had a big important stake in Canada, or up from Manhattan, right? It wasn't called Manhattan at the time. Because the British had taken over New York City, right? They owned it. So you have the possibility of the British coming in both directions. And so this right here is the turn where the Great Chain was put across the river. And there are still 12 existing links of the Great Chain at West Point on display. So after he was through working on the fortifications, he also joined the army, and he insisted to General Washington he wanted to join the Southern Campaign. He wanted to demonstrate himself in battle. And he oversaw a ring of African American spies in the Southern Campaign, participated in guerrilla warfare, and fought the last battle of the Revolutionary War. And he was granted dual citizenship and received the rank of Brigadier General at the conclusion of the war. So our relationship with Poland militarily goes way back. And in fact, today, if you were stationed in Poland, because we're stationing a lot more soldiers over in Europe again, you would be housed in the Kosciuszko barracks. And we also had the opportunity to interact very closely with exchange students, because West Point has students from all different countries come to West Point for 4 years and graduate from West Point. And so, endless stories about how great those Polish kids were. Okay, so next slide, Don. All right, he returned to Poland in 1784, and he was the leader of that nation's constitutional effort to free the serfs and to implement democracy. He is considered the George Washington of Poland. I mean, these are all things that I was learning as I started working on this. 1789, he was named general in the Polish army. He was named commander-in-chief of the Polish army in 1794. And he led the insurrection against the Russians and the Prussians who were occupying Poland. Ironic, right? I mean, here we are again. So, Kosciuszko's insurrection becomes the equivalent of the Declaration of Independence in Poland, and it produces the first democratic constitution to be written outside of America. Now, I don't know if you've been following the news on Poland this week, but Poland, for the last 6 or 7 years, has had a very far right, I guess you would say, government. But now they just had an election, and now they're bringing back the more democratic government. He returned to America for a time, and he became close friends with Vice President Thomas Jefferson. Oh, here, he suffered really bad battle wounds in Russia. He was a prisoner of war. He was captured by the Russians, and he was thrown into prison by Catherine the Great. So they kept saying to him, if you promise to never go back to Poland, we'll let you out. And he said, so this is Catherine the Great who's negotiating at this point. So he said, okay, here's what I'll do. I'll promise to never go back to Poland, but I want you to release the 10,000 Polish prisoners of war that you have in order for me to commit to that. And they said, okay. So he, on the way out, Catherine the Great handed him personally a beautiful fur coat with a big fur collar. And I don't know how much you know about Thomas Jefferson, but when he came back to America to visit, Thomas Jefferson said to him, oh, I just love your coat. That coat is fabulous. He said, I'm giving it to you. I don't want this coat. This coat was given to me by Catherine the Great. And so every picture that you see of Thomas Jefferson has a big fur coat on. That's Kosciuszko's coat. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? He lived in exile in France and Switzerland. He was world renowned for his efforts to implement democracy in Europe and for his contributions to the American Revolution. He died at age 71 in Switzerland. This is a tough story. And he left all the money that he had earned in the American Revolution to Thomas Jefferson to please, he begged him, free and educate your slaves. And Jefferson didn't do that. So there was a moment there, we had a moment there where something really significant could have happened. And so so it's all kind of a mystery where all that money went. All right, so next slide, please. General Washington and Kosciuszko resided at West Point at the same time for 4 months during the summer of 1779. Washington this is West Point. This is the big turn in the river. This is where the Great Chain would have been struck across. And Washington was obsessed with how important Fortress West Point was. And he said at the end of the war, he wrote in his memoirs of the war that Fortress West Point was the key of America. If it hadn't been for Fortress West Point, the British probably would have taken America. Okay, next slide, please. Kosciuszko was one of the officers invited to dinner at Francis Tavern in Lower Manhattan. How many people have been to New York City? Okay. Well, what was fascinating to me, because I had been there many times, but right down on Wall Street is where Francis Tavern is. And Commander-in-Chief bade farewell to all his officers and people who fought with him on December 4th, 1783. He raised a glass of wine, took a drink, and added, "I cannot come to each of you to take my leave, but I should be obliged if each of you would come and take me by the hand." Starting with General Henry Knox, each officer in succession stepped toward the leader, grasped his hand, and embraced him. No one spoke a word. When it was Kosciuszko's turn, Washington pulled off the cameo ring given to him as a member of the Society of Cincinnati, which is Army officers, and slid it onto Kosciuszko's finger. So he really thought a lot of him. All right, next slide, please. I told you this story, and Thomas Jefferson described Kosciuszko as the purest son of liberty that I have ever known. And near the end of his life, Jefferson sent a heartfelt letter to Kosciuszko asking him to please be buried next to him at Monticello. And Kosciuszko said, "No, I'm going to be buried in Poland." And I have been very fortunate to be invited to the Kosciuszko Monument in Poland 3 times. And so I've given quite a few speeches over there about Kosciuszko's garden at West Point, which not everybody knows about. The sculpture of Thomas Jefferson in the rotunda at West Point Library, this is Kosciuszko's coat that he's wearing. Okay, so next. So we're going to get into the garden itself. All right, so in the beginning, there were 2 cadets that started at West Point in 1804, and they found Kosciuszko's garden. They found the remains of Kosciuszko's garden. And so they put together the benches, they put them back. He had captured a natural fountain in the garden, and they restored that. And these are the first 2 graduates of West Point in the first graduating class, 2 people. And we have documentation of them having found this because it's in their writings. Okay, so next. During the time at West Point, Kosciuszko built a garden with his own hands, captured the spring. He built steps and a fountain with spouting jets and cascades. In 1769, before coming to America, Kosciuszko studied at the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris, as well as graduating from the Polish Military Academy in Warsaw, and attended classes at the French Military Academy. Next. Okay, so Brigadier General Joseph Swift is the first graduate of West Point, Chief Engineer in the Army, Superintendent of West Point, hero of the War of 1812. He wrote down this story when he was a cadet. Early in the summer of 1802, Lieutenant Macon and myself repaired the dilapidated garden of Kosciuszko, relayed the stone stairway to the dell, and opened the little fountain at the base of Kosciuszko's rock in the garden. Planted flowers and vines, constructed several seats, which made the spot a pleasant resort for a reading party. So they saved it at that point. Next. In 1828, cadets donated money to add a marble basin and a fountain to the garden. In 1830, first-classmen provided funding from their wages to maintain the garden. In 1856, Saratoga was painted on the wall, and then it was carved into the rock's face by Italian carvers. Next. So this is really interesting. There was a committee that was asked by the superintendent, at that time Sylvanus Thayer, and to name the person that they most wanted to honor from the American Revolution. And they chose Kosciuszko, and his monument is spectacular at West Point. But the cadet committee included Charles Mason, John Mackey, Charles Pettigrew, William Basinger, and Robert E. Lee. So, I mean, it's just sort of endless. All right, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but this is what the cadets said about Kosciuszko. They said that they had honored him because he was so dedicated to the notion of democracy, and not only in America, but in Europe. And that they learned from him that even though Poland was overtaken, that he demonstrated the capabilities and the leadership capabilities that they wanted to emulate. So you can go on, you're done. In 1848, historian Benson Lessing goes to the garden, writes a description of it, etc. Keep going. And it's a big tourist attraction. All right, so this is what it looked like when I first saw it. And Saratoga is carved on the left. So next. And this is up on the grotto level, so we'll keep going. In 1880 to 1863, the garden remains open, but it's unrestored. You see there's no flagstone or anything here. In 1963, a major addition is added to the Officers Club with a big metal ramp that cuts right through the view of the garden. That was the 60s. Okay, next. General Westmoreland, so this would be during Vietnam, approves plans to enhance Kosciuszko's garden. The dedication of the restored garden takes place in '69 with the former Polish ambassador president. Don graduated in 1970. I don't know, do you remember that? I have no idea. Polish veterans from Massachusetts dedicated money to the restoration. Okay, and then they bring soil from Poland, and from the battle he fought in Poland, which is in the garden. And it was deposited there in a special plaque. Okay. Kosciuszko led the battle against the Russians, defeated them in 1794, thereby providing the way for Kosciuszko's introduction and the development of the first constitution outside the United States. Okay, next. All right, so this is kind of what Kosciuszko's garden looked like the day that I saw it, and I said to Don, "Reverend Kosciuszko's garden," because we dated for 4 years there. I thought I'd seen every inch of it, but no, we've never been in the garden. Okay, next. Next. Thank you. All right, so this wasn't hooked up. The natural fountain here, the second level grotto was sort of destroyed. This is the view through the walkway to the Hudson River. But there's a happy ending to the story, so keep going. These are cadets in the garden during the Civil War. Cadets really like to hang out in Kosciuszko's garden, and they still do. Next. All right, so I found this invitation to the 1879 graduation hop, they call it, dances at West Point. And I looked and I said, wow, there used to be a bench up there. Who knew? We need to restore that bench. So I started working with the engineering department at West Point. Now these are all active duty Army officers, right, who fought in Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, and you know, they're real engineers. So, next. This is what it looked like after we had restored it. This was an article in the Daughters of the American Revolution magazine about the garden. There's a couple more pages of that, but I didn't include those. Go ahead, Don. All right, so I was just here at West Point in May, These are the cadets who rebuilt that tall viewing platform with the bench that I told you about at the top. And this was done in partnership, which we funded with the Friends of the American Revolution. This is the female cadet who was the head of the project. And I will just mention this, that in the past, there was tremendous concern on the part of a lot of West Point graduates when they determined that they were going to let women into West Point. And I remember it actually, because Don and I went to a meeting where the current superintendent spoke, and the entire message that he gave was, well, I just want all you West Point graduates to know that we are not going to let women coming to West Point destroy West Point. I mean, that was that era, right? So this year's graduating class, the top cadet in the entire graduating class is female. She's the second top graduating cadet. And the women that I got to interact with at West Point, the officers, the generals, were amazing. So this is them reconstructing, and you see the view of the Hudson River, and of course you would have had a view of the British coming right down. Next. And so I attended along with a member of my board their presentation. They got really good grade on having constructed this. Next. And then the Polish ambassador happened to be at West Point, so I talked to him. I sort of forgot a little detail here, but I guess I'll mention it right now. So we're stationed at West Point. We're living in Army quarters. And I get the doorbell rings, the front doorbell. So I go to the door and there's a guy standing there. And he said, I have a certified letter for you, and you have to sign for it. And I thought to myself, I'm sure we paid our taxes. I was like going through my mind, what could this possibly be? And I was like nervous. So I took the letter. I sat in my big chair, very slowly, carefully opened the letter. And the letter is from the President of Poland, who is giving me the highest civilian award from the country of Poland for Kosciuszko's garden work and Kosciuszko's work on the American Revolution at West Point. I was absolutely thunderstruck. It just came out of nowhere. So he was coming to West Point. He was going to be in America. So the president personally gave me that medal at the embassy in New York City. Is that amazing or what? Who would know? Wow, I was going to wear it. I forgot to put it on. But anyway, this is me lobbying the current Polish ambassador. Okay, next. All right, so this is the completed platform. The body of Kosciuszko's garden is, down the stairs. But this is the platform that they completed. This is an officer at West Point who's the son of my very close friend, who is the wife of the superintendent, 3-star general, when I was at West Point. She was very instrumental in convincing her husband that he needed to really support this work we were doing. So that gives you a sense of the garden. Next. Okay, so 1802, they put West Point there. At the conclusion of the American Revolution, I told you this, General Washington writes this, that this is the key of America. This Fortress West Point that Benedict Arnold was going to take over. Over 20 fortress sites from the American Revolution still exist. And we have very comprehensive engineering plans to restore them using dry stone stacking. Now there's one really giant fortification that they restored during the centennial. And they cemented we've succeeded in completing one fortification already. And it's all perfectly dry stone stacked. And this is experts from Europe who do all the castles in Europe, dry stone stack them back together. So it's pretty exciting. Okay, so then I was asked by the garrison commander, who came to me one day and said, Betsey, you gotta establish a nonprofit for Kosciuszko's garden. And I'm like, really? He said, yeah, that way you can legally get, you could get approval from the Pentagon and the state of New York, and you could save the fortifications. So I thought to myself, this is going to be really complicated. I've already done one PhD. This is going to be like another PhD. So I came back to the garrison commander and said, okay, here's the deal. We're going to establish the 501c3, get all the approvals from the Pentagon and everywhere else. But it's going to be to save not just Kosciuszko's garden, but all the remaining fortifications at West Point from the American Revolution. So that's our mission. That's what we're doing. And I was just in Washington, D.C. We had a really exciting evening at the Association of the U.S. Army in Washington, D.C. And our honored guest was Jack Reed, who is the senator who is the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and a West Point graduate. And then we had all kinds of other very interesting people there as well. Okay. All right, so here's the scoop. Manhattan, New York City is down here, okay? So this is like this incredible turn, S-turn, that takes place. This is West Point itself. All these little circles are locations of fortifications. We have remnants of all the fortifications. The other thing we have, which is really exciting, because it's a military post, they didn't build condominiums on top of all these fortification sites. So if they're falling apart, but all the rocks from the American Revolution are there. They're just scattered around, laying down the hill, etc. So we can do it, we can put it back together. And this is the great chain. This one across, and Kosciuszko's garden is right in here. So that's where that was. Right, next. Okay, so this is Colonel Dr. Blakeslee at West Point. I had to give him a little, And this is finally making it to Georgetown. That dream come true after 23 moves. So that's the story. I'm happy to take questions. Yes. The map, yeah. Would you go back to the map?
Are those 20?
Yes.
You
Okay.
said circles.
Which
Oh
one?
yeah, I have a pointer, right?
Right here.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and you want to know where they are, right?
Well, I was just kind of looking where you said circles, and I.
The very end button.
The bottom or the top?
Ah,
Doesn't seem to want to.
it does.
It's just pointing at the wall.
Oh,
There.
there it is. Okay. All right. So here are the fortifications. There are 3 here. This is the West Point. It is the piece of land that sticks out into the Hudson River, and that's why this is named West Point. And this is from before the American Revolution. So, huge fortification here on the plain. We have several walls still standing of that fortification. There are 6 or 7 fortifications over on Constitution Island. One spectacular fortification at the top of this mountain, really, that is almost 3/4 intact still, with the original walls that have been stacked by the Revolutionary soldiers. Pretty incredible. Washington had headquarters here. This is where the rugby center is today. And another fortification here, another fortification here because of the installation of the Great Chain. And then we lived here, and there were 2 fortifications here, right next to our house. As a matter of fact, you know, the historian I talked to you about, Jim Johnson, who we were stationed with in Germany during the Cold War, when Don was transporting nuclear warheads, which I didn't find out until like 4 years ago. This is locations of several fortifications. And then there's a fortification way up on this hill, and several more over on this side. And then there were 3 actually over here on the garrison side. They're almost completely fallen apart, but we will be able to put signage, appropriate signage there.
So basically, they were really around that West Point and not more on the Hudson River as it goes towards Manhattan.
Yes, so basically, the thing that people always think, of course, is that the British were going to attack from the river. But they knew they'd never make it. So the plan was that they were going to take the ships up from New York City and dock them about 15 miles down. And then they would march their troops up and come down. This is the highest fortification. They'd come through the woods and come down, and then take all the next levels of fortifications all the way down to the river. And that's how they would take the river. So that's how that was going to work. But at the time, well, Kosciuszko is the one who determined that you had to have some fortifications up in the woods. So, okay, next time. I don't know, is that? Oh yeah, so we're done. All right.
Betsy, is that chain still intact?
So, this is really the story about the Great Chain. So, they took the Great Chain apart. We should put it back so we have some light. Thanks. The Great Chain, they took apart and put the links into some building at West Point right after the American Revolution. And then they started destroying the links of the Great Chain. But somebody had the idea that maybe we ought to save a few of those links of the Great Chain. So there are 12 authentic saved links of the Great Chain. If you go to West Point and you go to this spectacular view standing where the Great Chain is crossed, there's a really cool exhibit of all of the links, 12 links connected with cannon from the American Revolution at West Point. And with cannon that was also taken by the American soldiers from the British.
How much of those links?
The links are about this long each, about this high, and they just weigh a ton. And so,
How did they
it's
put that
unbelievable.
across?
Okay, so what they did was to float each link on a wooden raft. And so the chain would be floating up in the water. It could be seen by the British, but it was being suspended on rafts. Now when Kosciuszko got there, he was working like crazy on the fortifications. They had put the chain in the river for the first time in the spring before. So it got to be like October and November. Somebody came up to Kosciuszko and said, we gotta figure out how to get the Great Chain out of the river before the whole thing freezes over. So Kosciuszko had to invent the process of how you would take that chain out of the river for the winter and then put it back in the spring. It was quite an engineering feat. Yeah, so that's a story. Any other questions?
Betsy, will you come back at some time and talk about Benedict Arnold?
I would love to talk because I've become obsessed with Benedict Arnold. And, you know, he was supposed to have his headquarters at West Point, right? But he didn't. He had his headquarters over here in a house that was owned by somebody who supported the British taking over America. And so on the day that he was found out, Hamilton and Lafayette were here at the house visiting him. He's the commander of West Point. And so they find out that in Tarrytown, I went to Marymount College in Tarrytown, which is, you know, further down toward the city. And a couple of guys had intercepted the messages that were being sent to where he explains what he's going to do about taking West Point. And so he finds out and he runs down to the river and he has his 2 soldiers take him. He said, I want you to take me to the Vulture, which is the ship that the British had, you know, docked down there further down. He gets to the Vulture, he gets off the ship and says, you know, I'm going to be a British citizen now. And he turned to his 2 men and said, if you will get on this boat, the Americans are never going to win this war. They're never going to win the American Revolution. So get on the boat with me, and I will make sure that you're protected and you will be okay. And they looked at him and said, we only serve one country. Got back in their boat and rowed back to West Point. So he ultimately, of course, went to England and became a British Army officer and led the troops that attacked his hometown in Connecticut. Not a nice guy. But what he did accomplish, Americans are very tired about the revolution at this point, and he ended up galvanizing people who were so angry about this. I mean, he'd been a hero in several battles for the Americans. And so it just, you know, his wanting to sell West Point to the British really turned the tide of the American Revolution. People were really mad. Okay, so did we go through all the slides? Okay, yes. Yes, Mary.
I'm having trouble. About how many American citizens were there at this period of time that were also angry? Where were they and how many of them? And
So, let me see if I can answer that question.
because we think, I don't know, I always think of that before there were very many people
Oh,
here.
no, there were people living all up and down the Hudson River. There were lots of people living in Manhattan. It wasn't, you know,
Well, I guess New York City, obviously.
New York City,
So there were lots of Americans.
right, and that was owned by the British because they had overtaken that. They had also overtaken battles in Long Island, and they had won several significant battles. They were partnering with some of the Native Americans that had had a bad experience with General Washington. That was his first command with Native Americans in Canada. And so there were many houses that had been built across the river. There were many houses that had been built for the Army officers at West Point. I mean, this was not like a deserted place.
So it's not just like colonies, it's actually established cities, and I don't think I really ever grasped it that way.
Well, then, if you think in terms of the colony of New York, you know,
Mhm.
you had primarily New York, but you also had Albany and lots of other cities, Tarrytown, and many other towns that existed all the way up and down the Hudson River. So it was going to be a battle. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. So start reading up on the American Revolution like I did in a big hurry. And you'll have a much better sense when we celebrate all this, of the significance of this.